On May 29th, 1925, Percy Fawcett mailed one last letter from Dead Horse Camp. Then he, his son, and a friend entered the Amazon, and the story fell silent. But the real mystery isn't just where he vanished, it's what the evidence reveals about the land and the people who live there. A century later, the forest responds not with a body, but with clues suggesting that the Z might have been real, just not in the way Europe expected. This investigation challenges the myths and invites you to question what really happened in the Amazon. I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends, whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. A letter is a fragile thing in the Amazon. Paper sweats, ink bleeds. A name can soften at the edges like it's trying to disappear before the reader even arrives. And yet, in May of 1925, a British explorer writes from Brazil's interior with the calm tone of a man who still believes the world can be held steady by punctuation. He signs cleanly, he adds coordinates. Later researchers and the family acknowledged he may have used misleading coordinates to throw off would-be followers. So even the coordinates may have been a decoy. He mentions supplies, health, the next step, ordinary details, the kind of husband writes to keep panic out of the room. But the place he writes from is not ordinary. He calls it Dead Horse Camp. Not as a metaphor, not as a flourish. Literal. A camp named for his own animal, dead on a previous journey, now reduced to pale bones in hard ground, whitening under a sun that does not negotiate. In that last letter, he tells his wife he expects contact with indigenous peoples in a week or 10 days. He says he is close to something. Close to what, he never says with the clarity the world later demanded. And then the letters stop. There is no final photograph to pin to a wall. No confirmed grave to argue over, no verified rescue signal, just the oldest terror in the history of exploration. Silence, a clean break, a sentence that never finishes. For a century, the world has tried to fill that silence with whatever story it prefers: hero worship, accusation, romance, conspiracy, a fever dream of the jungle as a hungry mouth. But from inside Brazil, from inside the Amazon, the story lands differently, because the Amazon does not swallow men like adventure movies claim. What it swallows is certainty. It dissolves the fantasy that maps are complete, that ambition grants immunity, that a land becomes real only when an outsider points at it and names it. So today we go into that silence, not to dress it up as a cursed fairy tale, not to use it as mystery tourism, but to understand what Percy Harrison Fawcett was truly chasing, what the Amazon was already holding, and why the lost city of Z may not have been lost at all, depending on who you ask and who gets to define the word lost. Because by the end, the question won't only be, what happened to Fawcett? The sharper question will be this: what happens when a foreign myth collides with lived territory, when an imported hunger meets a homeland that refuses to perform for it? Percy Fawcett was born in 1867, a British artillery officer, a geographer, a man trained to measure the world. And that detail matters because in the early 20th century, measuring was never measuring. Mapping was power. A line drawn on paper could decide who controlled a river, who taxed a trade route, who claimed a forest, who got to call a place frontier instead of home. Fawcett didn't simply arrive in South America one day as a romantic adventurer. He was already inside the machinery that produced those lines. He joined the Royal Geographical Society in 1901, and in 1906 the Society commissioned him for work that would pull him into the heart of South America's contested spaces. He began mapping from La Paz, moving into the Bolivia-Brazil borderlands, places where borders weren't abstract, where the earth itself was being argued over, and where surveying meant turning rivers and forests into something governments could claim with a straight face. In the beginning, this wasn't romance. It was the technical labor of an era when empires and republics alike wanted the interior translated into coordinates, made governable, made extractable, made legible to distant offices. And while outsiders often talk about the Amazon as if it were a blank green void, Brazil was not empty. Mato Grosso was not empty. The Upper Xingu was not empty. There were routes, posts, farms, missions, indigenous nations, regional authorities, and communities living the daily reality of frontier pressure, rubber, cattle, trade, violence, displacement, and disease. The rubber boom and its aftershocks mattered here. There were places where indigenous peoples met outsiders, not as curious characters in an explorer's tale, but as communities under invasion, angry at rubber barons pushing into their lands, bringing exploitation and death. So when someone says he vanished into nowhere, understand what that word is really doing. Nowhere is what the outside world calls a place it refuses to understand. Nowhere is what happens when distance turns someone else's geography into your own fantasy. Somewhere between 1906 and the early 1920s, something shifts inside Fawcett. The surveyor begins to move like a believer, not only a man who maps the Amazon, but a man who believes the Amazon is hiding a secret capable of humiliating Western certainty. Over the years, in 7 major expeditions between 1906 and 1924, he returns again and again, deeper and more complex, until the idea stops being a hypothesis and becomes a destiny. He becomes convinced there are remnants of an ancient, advanced civilization somewhere in the forest. He calls it Z, and people love to frame it as one man's private obsession, almost a personal madness. But that framing lets history off the hook. Fawcett did not invent the hunger for a lost city. He inherited it. He stepped into a river of older myths, myths that had been circulating through Brazil's interior since colonial times, carried by expeditions, by violence, by the constant search for land, gold, and the right to say mine. Brazil has its own long tradition of interior legends, born from centuries when outsiders and local elites pushed inward, sometimes with the Bible in one hand and the whip in the other. One document in particular haunted generations of imagination, Manuscript 512, preserved in the Brazilian National Library, an 18th century report dated to the mid-1700s, describing an alleged discovery of ruins said to have been found in 1753. People repeat its imagery like a spell, stonework, grand structures, inscriptions, because it offers what outsiders crave, the idea that Brazil is hiding a civilization that looks legible to European eyes. But here's the detail that matters, and it changes the flavor of the myth. The manuscript is often associated not with the Amazon, the way modern pop culture assumes, but with Brazil's northeast, far from where Fawcett would later hunt in Mato Grosso, and historians debate its authenticity and meaning. In other words, the geography doesn't neatly match the legend, the evidence is foggy, and yet the power of the story was real. It told readers that the interior was not only vast, but also hid something valuable, something that could be discovered and therefore claimed. Even when the map points one way, the hunger travels another. Myth moves like a river. It does not obey borders. And that is where the Latin American perspective bites. Because for centuries, these stories didn't float harmlessly above the canopy. They justified the intrusion. They transformed inhabited lands into treasure maps. They suggested that if something valuable existed, it belonged to whoever found it first, regardless of who already lived there, remembered it, named it, protected it, or suffered in it. Fawcett absorbed that logic, even if he didn't confess it plainly. Zale was not just a city. Zale was proof that the Amazon could be made legible on European terms, evidence that the interior could be translated into a language the metropoles respected. By 1920, he is actively theorizing about Zé, drawing on old Portuguese records, such as Manuscript 512 on Indigenous stories as he interpreted them, and on his own field notes. Underneath the romance, a cold argument was being made, that the Amazon had once held complex societies older and larger than Western academia had been willing to admit, because at the time, a powerful idea dominated much of outside scholarship that the Amazon's soils and climate made civilization impossible on a large scale, that the forest was too poor and too hostile to support dense populations or complex political life. And that idea didn't only shape classrooms, it shaped policy and imagination. It made it easier to see the Amazon as empty before conquest, as unused land, as a stage for foreign heroism. From our side of the world, that isn't just wrong, it is dangerous. Because if a land is imagined as empty, taking it becomes easier to justify and not lost, just not yours. Then comes the final journey, the one that turns biography into legend. 1925. Fawcett chooses to go small, almost surgically. No grand imperial caravan, no army, no spectacle, just 3 men, Percy, his son Jack, and Jack's friend Raleigh Ramel. In April of 1925, they set out from Cuiabá, a frontier capital linking Brazil's interior to the broader world. Cuiabá was not the edge of the earth, no matter how foreign papers later painted it. It was lived geography, a place with authorities, commerce, and people who understood that the interior was not an empty page. It was a world with rules. On April 20th, 1925, the party moves out with supplies, animals, and local support, crossing rivers, scrub, and forest. And here is a quiet truth that keeps being erased. Even when explorers brag about uncharted lands, they are often walking through pathways already known to local communities. The Amazon has always had routes of trade, kinship, diplomacy, danger, and memory. They don't always appear on European paper, and outsiders often mistake that absence for emptiness. By mid-May, after weeks on the trail, they reach Bakiri Post, an outpost marking the edge of regular communication. Bakiri Post wasn't only a waypoint, it was a demonstration of how the frontier tried to remake people. Fawcett didn't treat it like a simple mailbox. He looked at what was being called civilizing and wrote with disgust about the process, about acculturation, about the pressure of missions and contact, about a community being thinned by the very system claiming to save it. He even described the Bakari as dying out under those conditions. For him, that post wasn't just the edge of communication. It was the edge of a world where maps, progress, and bureaucracy had teeth. From there, on May 20th, Fawcett sends a steady letter. He includes coordinates. He assures officials that they are well. Specifically, he wrote from Bakiri Post as part of his expedition correspondence to the Royal Geographical Society and sponsors, and he warns that they are about to go out of contact. This isn't poetic, it is logistical. 9 days later, on May 29th, he writes again from Dead Horse Camp, describing hardship and noting the bones of his horse from an earlier journey. He calculated that contact with indigenous peoples would take about a week or 10 days. This is the last authenticated message anyone ever received from him. There is also a final dispatch intended for the outside world, routed through communication networks, in which he indicates their guides will turn back. From that point on, the three men move forward alone, and then the signal vanishes. Nothing. A blank space where the world expects an ending. Months pass, the silence becomes a headline. Rumors spread the way, fire spreads in dry season, fast, hungry, indifferent to truth. By late 1925, concern had turned international. Brazilian authorities conduct inquiries in the interior, trying to reconstruct what can be, but the interior does not readily give up its answers. Trails disappear, rivers shift, camps are reclaimed by vegetation. What sounds supernatural from far away is often just ecology up close. Growth is relentless. A camp can vanish into green the way footprints vanish in surf. And then come the search expeditions, scores of them over the decades, driven by sincerity, fame, obsession, and sometimes pure arrogance. Some later estimates climb toward 100 missions, but even the counting turns to fog in a story like this, because not every attempt was well recorded, and not every search looked the same. What matters is the pattern. People assume the forest works like a maze, repeat the route, and get the answer. But the Amazon is not a maze. It is a living system. It does not reward repetition. It does not keep its evidence neatly arranged for a detective story. The search becomes its own tragedy. More outsiders enter. More intrusions, more danger. And this is where the Latin American perspective sharpens like a blade. When outsiders disappear, the consequences do not fall solely on outsiders. Communities in the region get pulled into it, questioned, blamed, and pressured to provide explanations that satisfy distant audiences. Indigenous peoples especially become targets of suspicion because popular retellings keep reducing them to two roles, helpful guide or mysterious villain. Reality is heavier than that. History is heavier than that. If we are going to be responsible, we have to say it plainly. There is no single confirmed account of how Percy Fawcett died. There is no verified grave. There is no definitive physical evidence that closes the case in the way mystery consumers crave. What we have are reconstructions, testimonies, competing claims, some more credible than others. And one of the most important sources is not a British diary or a foreign newspaper. It is indigenous memory. In parts of the Upper Xingu, oral histories passed through generations describe an encounter with Fawcett's party, often linked to peoples such as the Kalapalo. In these accounts, the shape is consistent. Outsiders arrive, are received, food is shared, and warnings are given. Not superstition, warnings. Because in indigenous moral geography, hospitality has borders. Welcome does not mean unlimited access. Danger zones are not myths. They are maps drawn from experience, showing who is hostile, where conflict is likely, and what routes carry risk. One of the most cited indigenous-centered framings is, in its own way, painfully simple. We warned them not to go further. They went anyway. What happened next is where accounts diverge. Some narratives suggest they were killed after leaving friendlier territory, possibly by another group. Other versions emphasize uncertainty, the most honest kind. They went on, and they never came back. But from within an Amazonian lens, the emotional center is not the jungle devoured them. It is that they ignored what they were told, crossed a boundary on someone else's land, and then afterward, outsiders returned demanding answers, turning local communities into suspects in a story they never asked to star in. When later journalists and researchers blamed specific indigenous groups, those accusations often reflected desperation and bias more than proven fact. It is easy from far away to turn indigenous peoples into a convenient explanation. It is harder to accept the real lesson. Local knowledge is not decoration, it is survival. Now é brincadeira. This is not a game. And still the legend kept growing, feeding on the very thing it could not obtain, certainty. People claimed sightings, people claimed confessions, people claimed relics. In the early 1950s, even bones were pulled into the hunger. Orlando Villas-Boas announced remains said to be Fawcett's, and for a moment the world leaned forward, ready for closure, prepared for the forest to surrender a neat ending. But later forensic analysis concluded the bones were not his. Even death refused to be packaged cleanly. Even the grave became a rumor with fingerprints smudged by time. Then, when the legend seems locked into its old shape, another truth begins to rise from the ground itself, and it doesn't care about Fawcett's myth at all. For much of the 20th century, outside science insisted the Amazon could not support complex societies on a large scale. The soil was too poor, the environment is too harsh. Civilization, it was said, could not flourish there. That belief conveniently reinforced an older story that the forest was empty before colonization, pristine, untouched, waiting. But in recent decades, archaeology has been cracking that certainty open, not with stone pyramids and cathedrals, not with ruins shaped like European dreams, but with earthworks, engineered landscapes, and traces of settlement and planning. In the upper Xingu, one name keeps returning like a drumbeat, Kuhikugu, a complex within what is now the Xingu Indigenous Park, where remains of planned settlements, streets, bridges, and plazas have been identified, strengthened by remote sensing, such as LiDAR, which can see patterns the canopy tries to hide. You don't have to call it Z, you don't have to force a match to satisfy a story. You only have to admit what the land has been saying all along. The empty Amazon story is dead. Add to that the geometric earthworks and geoglyphs found in other parts of Amazonia and the dark, fertile soils of Terra Preta, human-made earth that remembers centuries of cultivation, and the picture becomes unavoidable. The Amazon wasn't hiding history. History was always there, but it did not look like Europe. It did not rise in stone spires. It lived in gardens, earthworks, waterways, managed ecosystems, and memory. And for many indigenous communities, these places were never lost. They were ancestral. They were known differently. They were carried in stories, in place names, in what the land teaches those who live with it. That line becomes unavoidable. It wasn't lost. You didn't know it. So what happened to Percy Fawcett after Dead Horse Camp? The honest answer is that we do not know in the clean, satisfying way mystery stories demand. We know the last dates, we know the previous coordinates, we know he expected contact with indigenous peoples, we know the warnings described in indigenous memory, we know the silence that followed, we also know something else that outsiders hate admitting: bodies can vanish in the Amazon without conspiracy. Certainty dissolves quickly when paper fails, signal fails, and ego insists on walking past the last safe line. And still the world kept feeding the myth because the myth pays. Decades later, the legend grows into books, films, tours, and prestige. In 2009, journalist David Grann revisited Fawcett's life and disappearance, pulling attention back to indigenous-centered threads that complicate the old hero narrative. In 2016, the story returns through cinema, shaped for a global audience that loves a single protagonist, beautiful, haunting, seductive, and still heavy with the outsider's gravity. Because mass media almost always wants one man at the center. But the Amazon is not a backdrop. Indigenous peoples are not side characters in their own territories. When outsiders disappear and become legend, someone else often inherits the consequences: trespass, extraction of stories, mystery tourism, pressure on communities, and the constant intrusion of curiosity treated as a right. So let's end where we began, with a letter sweating in the humidity. Fawcett's last confirmed words were not mystical. He did not leave a prophecy. He did not deliver a dramatic final quote. He said they were about to lose contact with each other. In the Amazon, that isn't a metaphor. It is physics. Signals die, paper rots, trails disappear. And if you treat local knowledge as optional, if you believe obsession grants entitlement, then communication is not the only thing that ends. Maybe Percy Fawcett was not swallowed by the jungle. Perhaps he swallowed an imported story about empty lands and lost cities and carried it until it could no longer survive contact with lived reality. Because the Amazon does not exist to complete anyone's fantasy. It is home. It is a corridor. It is an archive, written in water, soil, and memory. It does not rearrange itself to comfort outsiders, and it does not pause to explain itself to those who refuse to listen. Fawcett went looking for Z. The Amazon gave him silence, and that silence still forces a choice. We can keep telling the old myth, lone explorer versus savage wilderness, or we can tell the deeper story, a living world with sovereignty and a history that was never absent, only ignored. Porque al final, the forest didn't vanish him. It reminded the world of something unforgiving and straightforward. You cannot own what you do not understand. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's darkest stories are far from over.